Our next guest, a former NHL executive with the Canucks, Leafs, Coyotes, and Jets. And once upon a time, he did some radio in Vancouver.
He did indeed.
Couple of guys we know. It is our pleasure to welcome back to the program former Canucks Assistant General Manager, Mr. Lawrence Gilman.
There he is.
Gentlemen, it's nice to get the band back together.
Yeah, it's a Wednesday, and here you are. For those who don't know, we used to do an hour with Lawrence on Wednesdays.
Wow.
Called it Wednesdays with Lawrence Gilman. So it became a thing on our show for a number of years, and you were the forerunner of it. So thanks for doing that, and great to have you back here.
Well, it's nice to see you guys, and it's nice to participate.
Keep us up to date. Where are we talking to you?
I am in my condo, 1 block south of the St. Lawrence Market in downtown Toronto, a couple blocks east of the CN Tower.
And we get you as a free agent this year, correct? You were with the Leafs for a number of years, and that has come to an end. You're currently a free agent, is that correct?
For the time being, yes.
Yes.
I have had some discussions and currently am in discussion with a team or two.
Mm-hmm.
But, after 30 years of working in the NHL and 4 teams and being an assistant GM 3 times and interviewing for a handful of GM jobs, I figured it's time to take stock and see what I really want to do and who I want to work with and where I want to go. And I'm fortunate that I can take my time looking around.
Perfect.
And you follow him on Insta, you see his adventures, particularly time now with the kids, Lawrence. So happy about
travel
that.
show.
Yeah,
How about that?
Wow.
Eh?
They eat pretty well too, as I've noticed.
Well, my kids aren't kids anymore. So.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. And we back in the day, you had 2 little ones here in Vancouver. Now they're all grown up. Hey, tell us about your Toronto experience. What was it like working for the Leafs?
Well, it's very. I had time to contemplate this question, and the Leafs, as you know, were the 4th team that I worked for. And the prior 3 teams that I was with, the Winnipeg Jets 1.0, Phoenix Coyotes, and the Vancouver Canucks were either owned by one individual, a group of individuals, or in the case of the Vancouver Canucks, a family, the Aquilini family. When I came to work for the Toronto Maple Leafs, I didn't sign a contract with them. I signed it with MLSE, which is a conglomerate. At the time, Bell Globe Media owned 37.5%, Rogers owned 37.5%, and Larry Tannenbaum owned 20%. And their portfolio of sports teams wasn't just the Leafs. It is the Leafs, the Raptors, TFC, the Argos, the Marlies, the Raptors G League team. They own Scotiabank Arena. They manage Coca-Cola Coliseum where the Marlies play, as well as BMO Field. The Budweiser Theater is under their purview. They have a multitude of restaurants and, Maple Leaf Square. It goes on and on and on. As a matter of fact, Rogers just agreed to purchase Bell's 37.5% stake at $4.7 billion, which, if my math is correct, values the operation at something like $12.5 billion. It's a major corporation with over 1,000 employees. And obviously, with that comes corporate governance and structure and a different method of operation. And I thought about it in the context of decision making. I recall, and we talked about this on our radio show at one point, in my first year with the Canucks, in our first training camp, we had 2 young players on entry-level contracts in Mason Raymond and Yannick Hansen, deservedly beat out 2 veterans in Matt Pettinger and Jeff Cowan. And we had to set our rosters, and we had to make a decision quickly. Mike Gillis picked up the phone. Francesco Aquilini came from the Aquilini offices to the boardroom of Rogers Arena. And we explained that if you really want a winning culture here, we need to make this move, and we need to put $1.8 million worth of hockey players in the minors without return. And he made the decision in a split second to allow us to do that. And I just don't think you're getting Edward Rogers, Mirko Bibic, or Larry Tannenbaum down to Scotiabank Arena to the boardroom in 15 minutes. That doesn't mean to say that the current president of the Leafs, Brendan Shanahan, doesn't have the authority to make a decision like that, because he's going to have to explain it at some point. But it's a very different method of operation. And then when you look at the Leafs in particular compared to the other teams that I worked for, it's a massive hockey operations department. I mean, in its current iteration, the Toronto Maple Leafs, you have President Brendan Shanahan, GM Brad Treliving, and then you have 5 assistant general managers, 6 if you include Shane Doan, who's a senior advisor. You've got a player development department that has 10 people in it, whereas most NHL teams have half that. Like, it's a massive operation. There's a lot of moving parts, and at times it can be a little unwieldy. But you know, it's a fantastic organization, and it was a great experience for me coming here.
Okay, one thing the three of us all have in common is we've both worked in the Toronto and Vancouver markets. You weren't quite as front-facing in Toronto, Lawrence. I mean, here you used to speak on behalf of the club, and we're right there.
You got a lot of TV time in the box.
Yeah, you sure did.
Yeah.
But you know, juxtapose it. Tell us about the pressures of you know, what are the similarities, what are the differences between helping manage the Leafs and helping manage the Canucks?
Yeah, you were like Goldilocks. You had the baby bed in Winnipeg. You had then you know, I'd say the Canucks are in the middle size bed, and then you got the big bed, which has the most comfortable ride.
Well, I mean, listen, I'd be lying if I said, you know, the most enjoyable part of my career wasn't in Vancouver, because it clearly was. You know, the irony, the funny thing is, and Matt, you touched on it, the only people, as you know, the Maple Leafs PR policy is that the only people who speak on behalf of the team are the president, the general manager, and the coach. In that vein, when I walked around the streets of Toronto, the only time I got recognized was by Canuck fans. So it's a lot, you know, as far as doing the job goes. And I never minded anyone coming up to me on the street, because, you know, hockey's, you know, we're not splitting atoms in this sport. Like, it's a great thing to talk about with a rabid fan base, but it's different. I mean, you fly under the radar, believe it or not. I mean, I don't think that's the case for the Brendan Shanahans or the Brad Trelivings of the world, but you know, you go about doing your business, and obviously you have all the resources in the world to do them. And you know, it's very interesting, and I say this as not just as a hockey executive who's worked in both markets, but as a person who's lived a fair amount of time in both markets. It's so interesting that in Vancouver, the perception is that Toronto doesn't really have fans. They have these corporate pricks who, you know, descend from their ivory towers on Bay Street or at the banks or the accounting firms, and descend into Scotiabank Arena in their suits and ties and go to their luxury suites and their restaurants, and they don't have skin in the game, and it's a soulless, you know, market in that regard. Ironically, the perception from Toronto is that Vancouver really doesn't have very many fans, and people care more about other things in Vancouver, like going to Whistler or snowboarding or you know, kayaking. But the reality, there's perception and there's reality. Vancouver Canucks fans, as you know, are incredibly fervent, deeply love the Canucks, and believe that, you know, live and die with each win and loss. Most likely at this point, they're dying with the losses. And the Toronto Maple Leaf fans are equally as rabid. And it's a crazy hockey town where people absolutely love their Leafs, and they live and die with every win and loss. And, you know, it's so funny, the perception that each city has about the other team's franchise, and it's just not the case. And I know that it's similar in Edmonton and Calgary and Winnipeg and Ottawa and Montreal. I mean, hockey's part of the fabric of the society of this culture, and it's you know, the same everywhere. People love their team, people root for their team, and you know, it's been great. I've had the luxury and the pleasure of working for 3 Canadian markets, and it's been an awesome experience in that regard.
With that as a backdrop, talk to us about starts to the season in both of those markets, or just in general, because you know, the Canadian markets are all experiencing very different emotions with regards to that. Some at the low end, like the Canucks and the Oilers, some at the high end, like the Calgary Flames. Did you, as an executive, put much stock into the opening 5 games of the season? Intellectually, we all know there's 77 other games. In the Canucks case, 78 more games here because they've only played 4. But was it hard not to have an opinion on what you'd seen through 4 or 5 games?
Well, I mean, there's a difference between 4 or 5 games and two or 3. And
right.
when you do this job, you need to maintain an even keel. There's an old expression: if you think like a fan, you'll soon be sitting among them. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be looking at the signs. Is your team ready to play? Is it good enough? Is your goaltending good enough? How's it being coached? And for sure, you might have reason to be concerned through the first 3 to 4 games, probably more so through the first 10, because what ultimately happens in the NHL is when you look at, it's very difficult for a team to overcome a very bad start. Obviously, the Edmonton Oilers did it last year, going from nearly the bottom of the league to having a chance to win the Stanley Cup in Game 7. But teams even themselves out as you move past U.S. Thanksgiving and into the dog days of the season in December, January, February. So the start that you have can really have an impact on where you fall in the standings later in the year. So the answer is, should you be concerned? Mildly. Should you be reactive to that? Probably not. I think you got to let things play out and see how they go for the first 10 games of the season. But I wouldn't be waiting much longer after that.
I know you wanted to ask him about making trade.
Yeah, I mean, at what point, like for the Vancouver, let's just use the Canucks as the example right now here. They've called up Eric Brandstrom, whom I think you probably know well from being out east at a time when he was with the Senators organization. He's something. He's a left shot defenseman. They need right shot more than anything right now, but they also just need puck moving. So he's an interesting experiment if they choose to use him in Sunrise, Florida tomorrow night. But really, they need a top 4 defenseman, like a legitimate top 4 right shot defenseman. Things don't look good in the bottom 4 of their defense right now. And so we're querying here at this early junction of the season, do they bother going to sign the journeyman guy on the sidelines, the Shattenkirks, the Schultzes of the world, to get mildly better? Or do you hold on to that cap space, as valuable as that might be, in hopes that the Flames crash out and Rasmus Andersson becomes available and you can put together the assets for that? The hopes that in December, January, you can find like a legitimate number 3 right shot defenseman. But if you wait that long, you might be sinking too low at that point.
Well, first of all, top 4 right shot defensemen do not grow on trees.
Nope.
National Hockey. They're not. That is not an easy commodity to come by. And to get a Shattenkirk or a Schultz right now comes without a cost other than the cap space that you're going to have to either, in the Canucks case, if I'm not mistaken, they have about $500,000 in usable space. So they would have to make a move somewhere, send someone down, put someone on waivers, whatever the case may be. I watched in anticipation. I did some homework getting ready, and I saw you guys did. We're talking about Timothy Liljegren from Toronto, who I'm very familiar with, who may be a player who's on the market. I don't know.
And he's in that middle ground there, right? He's younger at least, great. And you get the extra year, which may or may not be a benefit, but he's not legitimately a top 3 guy yet either.
No, but he might not be far off. If you look at his underlying metrics, he moves the puck very well. He's got a decent shot. He generates offense. He's just not a physical defenseman. And most coaches in the National Hockey League want their defensemen to be, Tyler Myers-esque, with Quinn Hughes' skill. But it's a difficult question to answer. I have to think that the Canucks and other teams are looking at the market. I mean, the GMs talk to each other every day, so they've, in all likelihood, are exploring their options and weighing out what is the better move to make to see if you can get a defenseman who, well, it's funny, in the NHL. And in the American Hockey League and in every other league, I've seen the same thing. In September and October, you have too many defensemen. Suddenly, the calendar turns to December, and you don't have enough. Mm-hmm. So I have always been, very cautious and careful about moving any defenseman at this time of year because things can change very rapidly. Players can get injured. You can have certain players get hot, and it's not an easy. Trading defensemen is not an easy maneuver, and it's not for the faint of heart. And if I were a team looking to move one out, I would be slow and steady. And if I were a team trying to acquire one, I would be aggressive in trying to do everything I could to get one. But it's easy to grab one of the players that's not currently with the team. If you don't have to give up capital, draft capital, or a player, it's a very good option as well.
Yeah. I'm interested in what you've made of the work done here by this regime with Rutherford and Alvin, Lawrence. When they arrived on the spot, people thought it could take a long, long time to sort of unravel some of the bad contracts and cap commitments of the previous regime. Took a couple of years, and yet there they were last year vying for the President's Trophy and back in the playoffs as the number one, as the Pacific Division champion, the number 2 seed in the Western Conference. How they've done, how they do it. What have you liked about the way this regime is operated here in Vancouver?
First of all, Matt, you can't turn the Titanic around on a dime. It's not like the general manager can come in and put his or her stamp immediately on a team and change the fortunes overnight. It takes, a step-by-step plan that needs to be implemented. And I believe that the job that's been done in Vancouver by Jim Rutherford and Patrick Alvin has been not just good, it's been outstanding. They've made moves brick by brick. They've brought in great players like Philip Hronek, that have really made an impact. Jake DeBrusk, I think, was a really shrewd maneuver. But what I also like about them is that they're not afraid to make mistakes and admit to their mistakes and move on and take their lumps, as they did with Ilya Mikheyev. They brought Mikheyev in thinking he was going to be a top 6 forward. That clearly is not the type of player that Ilya Mikheyev is. And they assessed that. They took their lumps. They lost a draft pick. They moved a player, and they moved on. They've been decisive in their maneuvers. They brought in an excellent coach in Rick Tocchet, who I did have the pleasure of working with on the island of Misfit Toys in Phoenix, who's a tremendous hockey mind and a person who holds others extremely accountable. I can't say enough really for the job that they've done. And I think, yes, they're off to a bad start, but I think the Canucks are one of the top 4 or 5 teams in the Western Conference. And when they get their issues sorted, and particularly if Thatcher Demko comes back, they are a team that could compete for the Stanley Cup legitimately.
Yep. And I remember when they hired Alvin here, you were a big supporter of the move of a guy who had served his apprenticeship, moving up the ranks there in Pittsburgh and getting the big chair and the ability to impact an organization.
You mentioned Demko. Does the topic of goaltending just scare you? Like you had it so good here in Vancouver. Toronto has had a scattered record with goaltending, and now the Canucks without Demko. It's just a different world without Thatcher Demko. Goaltending's a funny thing, isn't it?
Well, as my good friend Alain Vigneault likes to say, my goaler is better than your goaler. I win.
That's the sport. Yes.
Your goaler is better than my goaler. I lose.
Yeah.
And that is why a good goaltender is worth his weight in gold. That's why Igor Shesterkin is holding out for as much money as he can get, because he is the reason the New York Rangers have a chance to win every night. I mean, they have a good team, but he's one of the top goaltenders in the National Hockey League. You cannot win without solid goaltending. It's not sustainable. It's not sustainable over a regular season. It's not sustainable in a 7-game playoff. So it's a critical factor for the Canucks. Not to say that Arthur Shilovs and crew can't, I don't hold them accountable necessarily for, the record of the Canucks at this point in time, but you need to have a bona fide number 1 goaltender or a tandem like the Bruins had last year with Swayman and Linus
Ullmark. Yeah. Do you think it screws with the team at all? The skaters? Do you think if they know that one guy is missing, that their cornerstone is missing? Do you think it has at least a subconscious effect on the skaters knowing that he's not there? They say no, but do you think it does?
Of course it does.
Yeah.
Especially if your team allows the first goal. And I've watched it because I've been on teams, as you pointed out, with suspect goaltending. And it's a demoralizing factor for the players, and it takes away from their confidence and ultimately the rest of their game. So, as I said, you can't win in any league, let alone the National Hockey League. In any hockey league, you cannot win without good goaltending.
Yeah. Well, and Garland was saying this post-game last night. I mean, that second period, Ratu, Besser, Garland, there were a number of chances there. It's Andrei Vasilevsky, man. And that's one of the reasons.
They won the period and we're down more.
Exactly. Yeah, you won the period, but their goaltender is pretty darn good, and the deficit grew.
Yeah.
and turned into an L. All right, we've kept you longer than I told you we would keep you. He just kept asking you questions.
Good answers.
Giddy
Yeah.
about having you back, Lawrence, and frankly, that goes for all of us here. Thank you for this. We'll catch up next Wednesday.
Well, thank you, guys. If I'm not gainfully employed elsewhere, I'll see you next Wednesday.
That's right.